The wind came first, not as a whisper, but as a solid wall of sound that slammed into the western face of the Wyoming high country. It was a sound Silas knew in his bones, a low, guttural moan that spoke of immense cold and impossible weight. He stood on the slight rise before his hollow, his hand resting on the warm, steady neck of his horse, Copper. The air, just an hour before a crisp autumn afternoon, had turned sharp and thin, stealing the breath from his lungs. The sun, a pale disk in a sky the color of milk and steel, was being erased from the top down by a sheet of bruised purple cloud, moving faster than any galloping horse. Copper shifted his weight, his ears twitching, his large, dark eyes fixed on the northern horizon. The horse felt it too. The animals always knew first. Silas gave the thick neck a final, reassuring pat. "Soon, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Time to go to ground." He grabbed the heavy bridle, his movements economical and sure, born of long years spent reading the land and the sky. There was no panic in him, only a grim, focused urgency. The time for preparation was over. The time for survival was now. He led Copper not toward a barn or a cabin, but to what looked like a simple swell in the earth, a green hillock that rose unnaturally from the prairie floor. A single, stout wooden door was set deep into its southern face, and a squat stone chimney poked from the top, a silent sentinel against the darkening sky. As they reached the door, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not gentle flakes. They were hard, dry pellets of ice, driven horizontally by the rising gale, stinging his exposed cheeks like thrown sand. He pulled the door open, a slab of thick, cross-braced timber that moved on heavy iron hinges. Inside, the air was still and quiet, filled with the scent of dry earth, cured pine, and hay. He led Copper into the small, partitioned stall he had built just inside the entrance, uncinched the saddle, and threw a heavy wool blanket over the horse's back. The temperature plunged outside. The wind's moan became a high, shrieking howl. The world beyond the door was dissolving into a white fury. Silas swung the heavy door shut, the sound a solid, definitive thud. He dropped a thick iron bar into its brackets, sealing them in. The shriek of the wind was instantly muted, reduced to a distant, angry hum. The hollow was secure. The earth held them, and the great Wyoming freeze of 1888 began. 6 months earlier, Silas had stood in Sheriff Brody's office. The air in the small room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and sawdust. On the sheriff's cluttered desk, between a stack of wanted posters and a half-eaten apple, Silas unrolled a piece of draftsman's canvas. On it, in charcoal, was a simple but precise drawing. A long rectangle dug into the side of a hill with a sloped, earth-covered roof. Sheriff Brody, a large man whose authority came more from his size than his intellect, squinted at the drawing. "What in tarnation is that, Silas? A new kind of root cellar?" "It's a dwelling," Silas said, his voice even. "A winter hollow. Some call it a walipini. It's an earth-sheltered structure." Brody leaned back, his chair creaking in protest. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of disbelief. "You aim to live in a hole in the ground, like a prairie dog? People out here build proper cabins, Silas. Good, honest log homes with stone fireplaces. That's how you beat the winter." Silas tapped a finger on the drawing. "A cabin bleeds heat from 5 sides, Sheriff. 6 if you count the floor. The wind strips the warmth right through the chinking. This," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "this only has one exposed wall to the south. The other 3 sides and the roof are insulated by the earth itself. The ground below the frost line holds a constant temperature. It holds the warmth. It's a principle. It's called thermal mass. The sheriff waved a dismissive hand. Principles don't keep your water from freezing in the bucket. A good hot fire does that. You'll need a mountain of wood for that thing. Less than you'd think, Silas countered. The chimney is designed for an efficient draw. The heat radiates from the stone and is held by the earth walls. It doesn't escape into the wind. He tried to explain what he had seen in his years as a cavalry scout in the high territories. He spoke of the blue northers, the sudden, catastrophic temperature drops that could kill a man in minutes. He talked about the old winters, the ones the new settlers had forgotten or never known, the winters the natives spoke of in their stories. Winters that lasted for months, with snow so deep it buried cabins to their eaves. Brody just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Silas, you've spent too much time alone out there. Your thinking has gone peculiar. You build that thing and you'll be the laughingstock of Prairie Ridge. A man living in a dirt pile. The sheriff's prediction came true swiftly. Word of Sod Hut Silas's and his prairie dog hole spread through the small community like a grass fire. Men at the general store would stop their conversations and grin when he entered. Children would point at him from a distance, whispering about the crazy old scout who was digging his own grave. He was offered advice, all of it condescending. He was told he needed more windows, a steeper roof to shed the snow, a proper wooden floor instead of packed earth. He listened to it all with a quiet, unwavering patience, and then he went back to his work. He was not building for them. He was building for the winter he knew was coming. The work began at the end of spring. He chose his spot carefully, the south-facing slope of a long, low ridge that offered protection from the prevailing north winds. The soil was a dense clay loam, perfect for the excavation and for the sod bricks he would later need. He did not have a team of men or a stable of mules. He had copper, a sturdy walking plough, and a wheeled scraper he had fashioned himself from oak planks and a strip of salvaged iron. The first task was to mark out the dimensions. A rectangle, 40 feet long and 14 feet wide, its long axis running east to west to maximize the winter sun. He drove stakes into the ground, his movements precise, his lines perfectly square. Then the digging began. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. He guided the plow as copper strained against the harness, the single blade biting deep into the prairie soil, turning over ribbons of thick, root-matted earth. Day after day, the slow process repeated. Plow, scrape, and dump. A pile of excavated earth grew steadily downslope. The hole deepened. He dug down 7 feet at the back, the north wall, and 4 feet at the front, creating a gentle slope in the floor for drainage, though he doubted much water would ever get in. The walls of the excavation were smooth and sheer, the dense clay holding its shape perfectly. He was not just digging a hole, he was sculpting the land, working with it, not against it. The townspeople who rode by saw a man toiling in a pit of dirt. Silas saw the emerging shape of a sanctuary. Once the excavation was complete, he started on the foundation. He hauled fieldstone from a nearby creek bed, load after heavy load, on a stone boat pulled by copper. He was not a mason, but he understood the logic of stone. He laid a dry stack foundation, a low wall 3 feet high along the interior perimeter of the pit. He chose each stone with care, fitting them together like pieces of a complex puzzle, using smaller stones to chink the gaps. This stone wall would serve as the base for the log walls and would prevent the earthen banks from sloughing inward. Next came the timber. He felled 20 lodgepole pines from a stand 2 miles away, selecting straight, mature trees about 10 inches in diameter. He and Copper dragged them back to the site one by one. He spent a week peeling the bark with a draw knife, the pale, clean wood gleaming in the sun. He let the logs cure for another 2 weeks before he began construction. He built the east, west, and south walls atop the stone foundation, a classic log cabin technique. But unlike a traditional cabin, his walls were low. The north wall was simply the hard-packed earth of the hill itself. He scribed each log to fit snugly onto the one below it, carving out a shallow groove on the underside so it would lock into place. He filled the small gaps with a mixture of clay and dried grass, a primitive but effective chinking that would seal out any drafts. He framed out a single doorway and 2 small window openings on the south-facing wall, the only part of the structure that would be fully exposed to the elements. The roof was the most critical element. It had to be strong enough to support several feet of earth and snow, a weight that would crush a conventional roof frame. He designed a reciprocal roof, a complex, self-supporting spiral of heavy timbers. Each beam rested on the one before it, creating a structure of immense strength and surprising grace. It was an old design, one he had seen used in the Mandan earth lodges along the Missouri River. It required no central post, leaving the interior space completely open. He wrestled the massive beams into place with ropes, leverage, and Copper's steady pulling power. It was slow, dangerous work. A single slip could be fatal. But his focus was absolute. He worked from dawn until dusk, his muscles aching, his hands raw. Finally, the interlocking frame was complete. A beautiful, powerful web of wood hanging over the hollow. Upon this frame, he laid thick planks of rough-sawn pine. Over the planks, he stretched a layer of heavy canvas, which he then waterproofed with a hot mixture of pine tar and beeswax, painting it on until the fabric was black and impermeable. This was his barrier against the dampness of the earth. Then came the sod. He used the very earth he had first ploughed up. He cut it into thick, uniform bricks, about 2 feet long and a foot wide. The first layer he laid grass side down, directly onto the tarred canvas. The roots would knit together, forming a dense, water-shedding mat. The second layer he laid on top of the first, this time grass side up. This living roof would grow, its roots intertwining with the layer below, creating an insulating blanket nearly 2 feet thick. In the spring, it would green up with prairie grasses and wildflowers. From a distance, his home would simply disappear back into the hill. The chimney was his final piece of engineering. He built it from the same fieldstone as the foundation, a solid, square column rising from the back of the hollow. He paid special attention to the flue, ensuring it was smooth and drew perfectly. He designed a clever damper system using a simple lever and a weighted piece of sheet iron, allowing him to control the airflow with precision, conserving heat and wood. He also built 2 ventilation shafts flanking the chimney. One was a low intake near the floor, the other a high exhaust near the ceiling. This would create a constant, slow-moving current of fresh air, preventing the buildup of smoke or stale air. It was a simple system, but it was vital. Stale air could kill as surely as the cold. With the structure complete, he began the final, crucial phase: stockpiling. For weeks, he and Copper hauled wagon loads of dry, cured firewood, stacking it neatly against the interior east wall until it reached the ceiling. He brought in sacks of oats for Copper, barrels of flour, salted pork, dried beans, coffee, and sugar for himself. He filled 2 large casks with clean water from the creek. He set up his simple cot, a small table, and a single chair. He arranged his tools, his books, and his few personal belongings. He was not just building a shelter, he was provisioning an ark. By the time the first frosts of late autumn silvered the prairie grass, the work was done. The winter hollow was a finished reality. It stood as a testament to his foresight, a strange green mound on the landscape that seemed to breathe with a quiet life of its own. The townsfolk of Prairie Ridge saw only a folly, an eccentric's dirt-covered whin. Silas saw a fortress. He saw a sanctuary. He saw survival. The weeks leading up to the Great Freeze were filled with a growing sense of unease. The social friction in town continued. Men would ask him with mock concern if his dirt roof was leaking yet. The women would eye him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He bore it all with a stoic calm that they mistook for foolishness. He bought his supplies, spoke little, and returned to his hollow. His isolation was a wall he had built as carefully as the one made of stone and log. The real warnings, however, came not from people, but from the land itself. The sky in the northwest took on a persistent, hazy, milk-white sheen that he had not seen in years. The usual boisterous winds from the west died down, and an unnatural, heavy calm settled over the plains for days on end. The air felt thin and brittle. The coyotes, usually a nightly chorus, fell silent. He saw herds of deer moving down from the high country into the sheltered river bottoms, a migration that was weeks too early. Copper was the most immediate barometer of the coming change. The horse grew restless, pacing the small corral Silas had built near the hollow. He would stand for hours, staring north, his nostrils flared, his tail twitching. He barely touched his oats. Silas knew this restlessness. It was the deep, instinctual fear of an animal that senses the approach of a predator. In this case, the predator was the weather, an immense, unseen beast gathering its power over the frozen pole. One afternoon, he felt a sudden, distinct drop in atmospheric pressure. It was a physical sensation in his ears and sinuses, a feeling he remembered from his scouting days just before the onset of a mountain squall. But this was different. This felt bigger, heavier. He looked at the sky. The milky haze was gone, replaced by a clear, impossibly deep blue. The air was so still he could hear the rustle of a single dry leaf 100 yards away. It was a beautiful, terrifying calm. He knew, with an absolute certainty that chilled him more than the air, that this was the last moment of peace. The beast was no longer gathering its power. It was on the move. That was when he saddled Copper and prepared to go to ground. Inside the winter hollow, the storm was a distant rumour. The roaring of the wind was a low, continuous hum, the sound of a faraway ocean. The earth and sod roof absorbed the vibrations, deadening the shrieking fury outside into a deep, resonant bass note. A single kerosene lamp cast a warm, steady glow over the interior, illuminating the stacked firewood, the neat piles of supplies, and Copper standing peacefully in his stall, munching on a ration of oats. The horse was calm now, his anxiety gone. He was safe. Silas stoked the small fire in the stone hearth. It was not a large, roaring blaze. It was a small, efficient fire of well-seasoned hardwood that produced a bed of glowing coals. The heat radiated outwards, warming the stone of the chimney and the packed earth of the floor and north wall. He checked the simple thermometer he had hung near the door. Outside, he knew the temperature was now likely 40 degrees below zero, and still falling, with a wind chill that was beyond measurement. Inside the hollow, the thermometer read a steady and survivable 52 degrees. The great thermal battery of the earth was working exactly as he had planned. It was soaking up the modest heat from the fire and the lamp and his own body, and holding it, refusing to surrender it to the lethal cold outside. He thought of the others. He thought of the Miller family. John Miller had built his new cabin a mile down the creek. It was a fine-looking cabin, built from squared logs with wide glass windows and a tall, impressive chimney. Miller had laughed the loudest when Silas had described his hollow. "A man needs light and air, Silas," he had boomed. "Not a burrow. My wife would never stand for it." Silas now imagined that fine cabin. He imagined the wind, a razor-sharp intruder, finding every tiny gap in the chinking. He imagined the glass windows, bleeding precious heat, turning into sheets of interior ice. He imagined their fireplace, a ravenous monster devouring wood at an unsustainable rate, its draft sucking more warm air up the chimney than it produced. Their home was a sieve, and the cold was a flood. For 2 days, he and Copper existed in their subterranean calm. He would read by the lamplight, mend a piece of tack, or simply sit and listen to the muffled voice of the storm. He fed and watered Copper, checked his supplies, and kept the small fire alive. The routine was a comfort, a small pocket of order in a world of chaos. The ventilation shafts worked perfectly, drawing in fresh, frigid air that was quickly warmed, while expelling the stale air up and out. The air in the hollow remained clean and breathable. On the morning of the 3rd day, he was jolted from a light sleep by a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, rhythmic banging on the heavy outer door. It was a desperate, muffled sound, almost lost in the gale. Silas grabbed the lantern and moved to the door, his heart pounding. No living thing should be out in this. He lifted the heavy iron bar and pulled the massive door inward. A figure, a sculpture of snow and ice, stumbled in and collapsed onto the earthen floor. It was John Miller. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His face was a waxy, terrifying white. His eyes were wide, with a frantic, primal fear. "Help!" he croaked, his voice a ragged whisper. "My family!" Silas dragged him further inside and slammed the door against the invading storm. He stripped off Miller's frozen coat and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket, pushing a tin cup of hot coffee into his trembling hands. "What happened?" Silas asked, his voice calm and steady. Miller's story came out in shuddering gasps. The chimney. The fireplace had been run so hot for 2 days straight that the creosote in the flue had ignited. The chimney had become a torch. The fire had spread to the roof. They had escaped the flames only to be met by the freeze. Their cabin was a burning pyre in the heart of the blizzard. His wife Martha and their 2 small children were out there, huddled in the lee of a rock outcropping, not 200 yards from where the cabin had stood. They would not last much longer. There was no hesitation. Silas pulled on his heaviest buffalo coat, his fur-lined hat, and his thickest mittens. He lit a shielded storm lantern and grabbed a coil of rope. He looked at Copper. "We have to go out, boy." The horse met his gaze with trusting eyes. He led him from the stall, threw a blanket over his back, and opened the door once more to the screaming white hell. The wind tore at them, a physical blow that threatened to knock them off their feet. He tied one end of the rope to the doorframe and the other around his waist. He handed the lantern to Miller. "Stay here. Keep the door clear." Then he and Copper plunged into the storm. The world was a churning vortex of white. Visibility was less than 5 feet. The cold was a living entity, a predator that clawed at any exposed skin. But Silas was not navigating by sight. He was navigating by memory. By the lay of the land he knew as well as his own hand. He kept the wind on his left cheek, knowing it came from the north. He knew the creek was to his right. He trusted Copper to find his footing on the treacherous, snow-covered ground. They found them, a small, pathetic huddle of humanity, already succumbing to the cold's embrace. Martha Miller was trying to shield her 2 children with her own body. They were barely conscious. Silas worked quickly. He wrapped the children in the blanket from Copper's back and hoisted them onto the patient horse. He half-carried, half-dragged Martha, shouting words of encouragement that were snatched away by the wind. They followed the taut line of the rope back through the blinding chaos, a lifeline to warmth and safety. When they stumbled back through the door of the winter hollow, the contrast was staggering. They moved from a world of lethal, screaming madness into a haven of quiet, steady warmth. John Miller wept openly as Silas and he stripped the frozen outer clothes from his wife and children and wrapped them in every blanket they had. They laid them close to the hearth, and slowly, miraculously, the life began to seep back into their frozen limbs. The 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes at the curved log ceiling, the earthen walls, and the big, calm horse standing in the corner. They had been saved, not by a proper house of wood and glass, but by a hole in the ground. The earth held. The roof held. The foresight of the man they had mocked had held. The great freeze lasted 1 more day. When the wind finally died and the silence descended, it was more profound than the storm itself. Silas opened the door to a new world. The landscape was utterly transformed, buried under a deep, sculpted blanket of white. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold it cracked in the throat. He and John Miller ventured out. The Miller cabin was a blackened, ice-encrusted skeleton. All around them, the prairie was dotted with the small, sad humps of frozen livestock. Other cabins were invisible, marked only by a wisp of smoke from a chimney, or, in some tragic cases, by no smoke at all. The cost of the storm had been immense. 2 days later, a rescue party from the main settlement, led by Sheriff Brody, made its way up the creek. They were on snowshoes, their faces grim. They had been checking on the outlying homesteads and had found mostly tragedy. When they saw the strange green mound with a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney, they stopped. They saw Silas emerge, followed by John Miller, and then, unbelievably, by his wife and 2 children, all of them alive and well. Sheriff Brody walked forward, his face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and profound shame. He looked from the healthy, living family to the simple, earth-covered structure. He looked at the thick door, the stone chimney, the ingenious design that had weathered a storm that had destroyed far grander homes. He looked at Silas, not as the town fool, but as the only man who had truly understood the fury of a Wyoming winter. He took off his mitten and extended his hand. "Silas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were wrong. My God, we were all wrong. You tried to tell us." Silas simply nodded, accepting the apology without triumph. There was no need for it. The proof was all around them. In the weeks that followed, as the survivors of Prairie Ridge dug out and counted their losses, a slow procession of townspeople made their way to Silas's hollow. They came not to mock, but to learn. They asked about the reciprocal roof, about the thermal mass of the earth, about the ventilation shafts. Silas shared his knowledge freely. He sketched his designs in the dirt, explaining the principles of solar orientation and earthen insulation. He held no grudges. His vindication was not in their apology, but in the simple fact that the Miller children were alive. 20 years passed. The town of Prairie Ridge survived, and it changed. The Great Freeze of '88 became a defining legend, a harsh lesson etched into the community's memory. And the landscape changed too. Dotted among the traditional log cabins were new structures, built low against the south-facing slopes, their roofs green with prairie grass in the summer and heavy with insulating snow in the winter. They were known locally as Silas Hollows. His design, once a subject of ridicule, had become the standard for wisdom and resilience. Silas's original winter hollow became a landmark. He lived in it for the rest of his long life, and after he was gone, the community maintained it. It served as an emergency shelter during the Great Blizzard of 1908, saving another dozen lives. It stood as a permanent, silent monument to the man who had listened to the land instead of to the loud, confident voices of men. The story taught a hard and simple lesson. True wisdom is often quiet. It does not need to boast. It is measured not in words, but in deeds, in the careful stacking of stone and the patient turning of the earth. It can be mistaken for madness by a world that has grown deaf to the whispers of the wind and the warnings of the sky. But when the storm comes, it is not the man who is proven mad, but the world that was not wise enough to listen. Beside the old hollow, there is a simple, weathered stone marker. It was placed there by the children of John Miller. The inscription does not speak of the storm or of the folly of the town. It is a simple tribute. It reads, "Silas Croft, he understood the earth." And just below that, a second, smaller line was added years later. "And his horse, Copper, who knew to trust him."